Hello, my name is Elizaveta. My thesis is a work in progress on dynamical patterns in neural systems, but today I thought that for the next 8 minutes we're going to look at emergent properties of dynamical systems in the world and draw some conclusions for it that can be relevant to all of us. So as a sophomore, I was interested in studying the notion of continuity, and even though I diverged from that path a little bit, you can still trace the remnants of that thought still in this work. So our main words for today are going to be dynamical, meaning changing in time, and systems, collections of interacting components. I mean that in the broadest way possible. So living systems are an especially beautiful gift of this world. Just ponder this with me. They evolved without supervision through a long, iterative, historical process that is called evolution. And due to that process, every living thing that exists right now is causally linked to everything that happened in the world in the past. And that past is irreversible. These systems self-organize and adapt. And yes, they don't have ghosts inside them who assemble their parts in specific patterns that you want to see. Instead, the notion of emergence, having something none of your individual parts have, accompanies living systems everywhere they go. So to quickly make a physical standpoint here, living systems must be open, meaning they interact with the environment through exchange of information, matter, or energy, and they need to have a supply of energy from inside or outside through some metabolical process, which if stops, the system dies. So one useful thing to do when analyzing a system is to think about its state space. State spaces of complex systems are incredibly huge, and living systems are complex. But living systems have an interesting point in this. During their life, they traverse only a very small area in that state space because there are many more ways to be disorganized than organized. They traverse that little domain in space in the state space called alive, and if you cross the boundary of that space, there's no coming back. So the stakes are very high, and the system must stay online and on the task all the time. It needs to constantly maintain its homeostasis because there is no way of getting it back if you lose it. So now let me say a quick thing about the world that we live in that is relevant to the systems that live in this world. So our world, especially on the biological and societal scale, is primarily made of short-range interactions, meaning forces that influence parts in the world are most of the time local. Think about molecules bumping into one another when you get a sensation of touch or sound, or photons hitting the retina, or animals communicating. All of that is short-range interactions. So the system, to stay alive, needs to monitor, draw information from, and act upon proximal interactions. In fact, this local property of the world is believed to have contributed to emergence of life itself, because it might have given rise to emergence of physical boundaries, membranes, that were necessary for creation of living systems. So locality should already prime us to think about bottom-up processes and emergent properties, because if you're going to take a top-down look at the system, you will need to be kind of some distance away from it, and you won't be a part of it anymore. Let's continue. We have a living system that exists in the world of short-range interactions. So now let's see how its perception and action states emerge. So short-range forces constrain the set of states that can causally influence a given state. I mean, it's reasonable, right? Everything cannot be influencing everyone all the time. You got to obey constraints of space and time. So in that constrained condition, probabilities of conditional co-occurrence of states become informative. And we see emergence of boundaries that separate conditions from being dependent on one another. And that creates boundaries that exactly create a distinction between the inside and the outside, and they itself serve as the interface of the interaction. For a big system, you can do this too. It's called the Markov blanket, and it's literally separating the internal states from external states, itself the Markov blanket being the interface of interaction. And the states on the blanket, depending on the direction of causality, can be labeled sensory or action states. So altogether, the Markov blanket is the thing that creates the identity of a biological system. And if a Markov blanket gets destroyed, then the system no longer has coherence and integrity. So the world of biological systems is full of Markov blankets within Markov blankets within Markov blankets. But I'm not going to go into the embeddings of them into one another. So we get an organism that lives by perceiving and acting on the world. It's embedded in the context, it's brought up by a historical process, and its life in the world is dictated by its sensory and action states. So isn't it time to say enough with emergent properties, let's have a top-down look. The environment is giving us perceptions, we're gonna spit out some actions, why not have some primary units that we're gonna assemble by a central pattern generator into something that we wanna see? Well, no. First of all, nothing in nature has this power for manipulation, and hierarchies do exist, but they're always bidirectional. For top-down control to happen, the information needs to reach the top levels through a bottom-up process. And we shouldn't forget that the organism continues existing in the world of short-range interactions, locally and in time. So what it means is that perception, agent, action is not an arrow, it's a loop. And moreover, it's not going to wait, meaning perception is not going to wait for action to end to start perceiving again. So it's more of a flow. Perception action is a constant stream of information. It's discretized only at the level of receptors, but the organism doesn't notice that discretization. So let's conclude something. Dynamical patterns that the system exhibits due to the causal influence from the environment is the system's most primitive memory trace and a model of the environment. These patterns can be called computations, and in that way, biological systems are doing computations all the time. Cognition is an emergent property of these computations. It makes certain internal states more explicit than others, giving rise to a sense of awareness. So I encourage you to embrace that dynamical aspects of questions you work with, whatever the domain is. And while you're at it, instead of thinking of competition and top-down orchestration of primitive units, think interaction, self-organization, emergence, and let's appreciate birds flying and millions of neurons firing and the dynamical nature of the world we live in.
Okay, questions?
So you mainly applied it to biological systems, but can it also be applied to physical systems? Use the pendulum as an example.
Right. Physical systems have emergent properties. And the sense of locality, the fact that local range interactions, it's considered good etiquette now in physics to reformulate any law that's talking about long range interactions into a local form. Differential or using fields, and phenomena that don't have this local interpretation bother physicists a lot, like quantum entanglement. Yeah, and they can't be explained because you can't have instantly fast propagation of information. And there is a deep sense in which this world is local, and I don't think we know why, but it's definitely, I think it's one of the fundamental properties of the world we live in.
If the Markov blankets you're talking about are bounded Markov chains, does history matter in a way? In other words, insofar as the previous state is the only thing that you need to determine determine the next state, et cetera? And if so, how do we think about timescales within your area of dynamic systems?
Right. So time and historicity does matter in the sense that it is a Markov blanket. The thing it's saying is that out of all states that are influencing one another, there's only a subset that's relevant to what's going to happen to the internal states, because you can't have all the states influencing all of the states. So there must be a subset that is the most relevant. And in that sense, it's a Markov process, because at some point the causality, you don't need to trace it all the way back to where it originated. I don't know if that creates problems with time. I think time still remains untouched in this approach. Yeah.
Go back. I've got one for you. Go back to your birds. There we go. All right. So just for the purpose of making clear to everyone in a very concrete way what you're talking about, can you give sort of a traditional top-down explanation of what's going on in that bird flock, and then a more dynamic, short-range interpretation of what's going on?
Okay, so top-down would be to say that each bird knows that it's in a flock and they're supposed to be doing this shape right now, so let me get into position in order to fulfill that goal of creating that shape. Bottom-up would be each bird has some local notion of its goals and orientation, like how to change orientation when it gets close to one bird, what direction to go to if it gets far enough from local birds, and it's kind of assessing its neighborhood only. It's not looking at the million other birds, well, I don't think it's a million, but 100 other birds that are around it. And all together, each bird doing that process on its own, create this emergent property of doing this beautiful, beautiful dance.
So you get purposeful looking behavior without teleology. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.